It is now official. CNN projects that Donald Trump has been elected president, defeating Vice President Kamala Harris and making a political comeback unlike any in modern American politics.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming back and joining us for the third episode of Crime and Punishment. And today's guest is law professor Anthony Michael Kreis. I'm really excited about Professor Kreis joining. Professor Kreis is not only a well-known law professor down here at Georgia State Law School, where I also teach, but also he's become, I think, pretty famous on Twitter, commenting on the election and the YSL trial and all sorts of legal issues going around here in Atlanta and around the country. So, Professor, welcome. Thank you so much for joining.
Glad to be here and happy to chat about a lot of exciting and interesting, and I guess depending on how you look at it, very, I guess, I don't know, pressing matters in the legal world and the constitutional realm. So it's always good to chat with folks about that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Can we start off? I know about you, having kind of studied your work and followed you, but there might be a few people out there, I doubt it, but maybe one or two people who don't know about you. They clearly will after this. So can you just kind of explain what you do, what kind of law you teach at Georgia State, and how you got to where you are?
Sure. So I teach constitutional law primarily, and I teach a few other courses like employment discrimination, but my focus is generally on constitutional law. And in addition to having a law degree, I also have my PhD in political science and public administration from the University of Georgia, where I've studied more or less political history and the way that political history interacts and has a kind of interactive effect with the law and how law changes over time. So a lot of my work is grounded in history. It's grounded in trying to figure out why the law changes the way it does and how politics influences how we think about the law and how the law develops. So a lot of my analysis, a lot of my scholarship, and even frankly, the way I teach constitutional law is always through the prism of history in addition to doctrine. And so I think doctrine's important. I think history is important. I think politics is an important thing to think about when we talk about law. And so, oftentimes, you'll kind of see an amalgam of all of that show up in the way I think and talk about the law. And I'm sure that'll come out a bit today as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, I've heard so many times, both when I was a political science major in college and when I was in law school, and now you hear it all the time, no one is above the law. No one is above the law. That's what we hear. Okay, so here we are in November 2024. Donald Trump, who's going to be our next president, and we're not going to get in, you can if you want, but I won't get into whether I like Donald Trump, don't like Donald Trump. I'm just talking about the legal aspects. Donald Trump is a defendant in 4 cases, if I'm counting them all. New York, where he's already been convicted of 34 felonies, and he's set to be sentenced soon. Georgia, where he's a defendant in a RICO case brought by DA Fani Willis here in Fulton County. In fact, full disclosure for the audience, that's how Professor Kreis and I really got to know each other through that case. I used to represent one of President Trump's co-defendants, Ken Chesborough, who has since pled out. So that's the second case. Third case is the January 6th case that's pending, that was brought by Jack Smith, that's pending in Washington, D.C. And then the fourth case is the document case that was pending in Florida. This is the case where Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, alleges that Donald Trump took some documents and retained some classified documents that he shouldn't have. That case was pending down in Florida. It's not pending in the district court anymore. It was dismissed, and now it's pending in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. So 4 cases. Now Donald Trump has been elected to be president. He's going to take office, January 20th. No person is above the law. So tell us, Professor Kreis, What's going to happen with those 4 cases?
Well, let's start off with the big elephant in the room, which is it may be the case that sometimes somebody may just be above the law. And it just has to depend on what position they hold and whether or not they're standing for election to the presidency of the United States. And there's some good reasons for the outcomes that we're about to talk about, and there's probably some really hard truths about democracy in this conversation as well. So I'm sure we'll get into all that. But let's just stop and I think focus on case by case what's likely to happen. So let's do the easy cases. So the easy cases are the federal cases that are pending that were brought by Special Counsel Jack Smith in Washington, D.C. and in Florida. The basic bottom line here is this. Donald Trump, when he takes the reins of the presidency and it was essentially the head of the executive branch of the federal government, will have the full power, if he wants to direct his attorney general to terminate the office of special counsel and direct the Department of Justice to have all the charges against him dismissed. Given the fact that that's an inevitable consequence of this election, the Department of Justice and the special counsel have already taken steps to kind of unwind the prosecutions for the January 6th case and the documents case. And I think that they're going to make sure that case is closed before Donald Trump assumes the presidency. So it seems like that is kind of winding down already in anticipation of Donald Trump becoming president, because Trump could in fact just have those cases dismissed. What's unclear to me in those cases, however, is that there were in the Florida documents case, there were indicted co-conspirators, and in the DC case, there were unindicted co-conspirators. And so whether or not cases in the Florida documents case, whether something will continue to proceed there is unclear to me. That's certainly something that's unlikely, I think, to happen, given the turnover of political appointees who will soon be put in office by Donald Trump in the United States Attorney's Office in Florida. And I think so the likelihood of prosecution is pretty much zero for those co-defendants. And of course, then there's the possibility of pardons. And so I think Donald Trump will, in fact, issue pardons for his indicted and unindicted co-conspirators to ensure that they won't get prosecuted federally down the road. So that's case number one. The second case,
I apologize. Could I just
yeah.
Just for the folks, because I think a lot of people listening to this will be attorneys, some might not be, and even some attorneys who don't practice criminal law or this type of law might not understand. When there's a new president, and this is not just Donald Trump, this is every president from the beginning of time. When there's a new president, that president gets to make certain political nominations, appointments, whatever you want to call them. And one of those categories of nominations is for United States attorneys all across the country. And just so everyone understands, there's 93 U.S. attorneys' offices across the country. They all are part of the Department of Justice, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. And every 4 to 8 years, all of the top leadership in those agencies and offices roll over because a new president is able to, and usually does, find replacements. So we're going to have a new U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C. We're going to have a new U.S. attorney in Florida. And the Trump DOJ could simply instruct those political appointees to withdraw, to terminate, to end those 2 cases. And let me ask you this, Professor, and this is probably a hypothetical question because I agree with you. That's probably how it's going to go down. You said that Donald Trump could pardon his co-defendants in the federal cases, his unindicted co-conspirators in the federal cases. He could pardon anyone he wants. The Constitution has a pretty broad pardon power. If he had to, could Donald Trump, you think, pardon himself?
That is the great question of constitutional law at the moment, in large part because In the presidential immunity case over the summer, the Supreme Court essentially said that the pardon power is entirely within the president's prerogative to use as he or she sees fit. And it's an unreviewable matter. And in large part, they talked about that in context of criminal prosecutions pursuant to the use of the pardon power. So this is an open-ended question that has not been, kind of resolved in any way by the presidential immunity decision, but it strongly suggests that a self-pardon may very well be available to the president. So we'll have to see how that weighs out. I think there's a really good chance that Donald Trump will try to pardon himself at some point. How that would get challenged down the road is another great question too. So not only do we have this open-ended question about the constitutional validity of self-pardon, but then there's this question of, well, how would you challenge that? And it would really, I think, in many respects require a potential, or I should say, a prosecutor down the road who wants to federally, prosecute or indict the Donald Trump for something that he did that was covered by that self-pardon. So, and of course, by this point, those charges would already been dismissed. So, I'm really not sure if it's going to happen or to what extent somebody will want to or be able to challenge it down the road. But that's certainly, another big constitutional law question that's kind of lying, in wait for us down the road. But I would also note, of course, that while President Trump, or I should say President-elect Trump, while he could potentially self-pardon himself and additionally pardon others who are unindicted co-conspirators or indicted co-conspirators, he cannot use his pardon power to reach state crimes. So people who might have committed parallel state crimes will not be able to cloak themselves in the pardon power's immunity that they would on the federal level. And that, of course, is really important when we get to talk about Fulton County in a few minutes.
Okay, so basically the federal cases are all but gone. As you said, Jack Smith has already filed documents in court suggesting that he's working on wrapping these cases up because he understands that that's going to happen sooner rather than later. Might as well be sooner, I guess, is Jack Smith's thinking. So those cases are now gone. So now we're left with the Fulton County case in Atlanta. That's the RICO case that I was involved in at one point, how we met. And then you have the New York case. So what happens, you think, with those cases?
Yeah, so let's take a stab at the New York case first, because I think that's probably the clearest, and we have the clearest answer for that one. So in the New York case, there's still a pending motion to vacate the jury's verdict because there's part of the allegation there, or I should say part of the argument there, is that there was impermissible evidence used that was cloaked by presidential immunity in order to secure Donald Trump's conviction. And so Justice Juan Merchan, who is the trial judge in charge of that case, is still reviewing those issues there. But ultimately, the question about sentencing, I think it's really easy. There are a lot of folks on Twitter who seem to have magically gotten law degrees overnight and studied constitutional law forever, and it's just lovely. However, they're wrong. The idea that has been seemingly taking a lot of oxygen in liberal circles that the state of New York can imprison Donald Trump is just flat out, I think, wrong. So the truth of the matter is, if the people of the United States thought that Donald Trump's crimes and alleged crimes were so terrible as to be disqualifying, the option was to, for Republicans not to nominate him and for the public not to vote him back into office. The state of New York's interests must be subservient to that outcome in the election, full stop. And I think, of course, here, part of the reason why people feel the way they do about this is because the kind of procedural posture, right? Which is there was conviction first, and now he's been elected to be president-elect. But imagine, right, the other way around, that the consequences of this idea that a state could imprison a sitting sitting president, right? So you can imagine, for example, Joe Biden wins a second term in an alternative, this kind of alternative universe, and the state of Texas decides to prosecute him for something. And let's just say they secure a conviction, however flimsy the evidence and the legal theory might be. The idea that the state of Texas could whisk Joe Biden away and throw him behind bars and entirely undermine the federal government's ability to operate is absurd. Nobody would believe that is a proper function of federalism and state and federal relations. So I understand why people feel the way they do because of the ordering of things, but the principles of federalism, the way our Constitution is structured, simply put, there's no way the state of New York's interests here outweigh the federal government's interests. So Donald Trump will not be going to prison, at least in the New York case. And if there is any possibility of prison for Donald Trump down the road, and that's a big if, it'll probably be in a state like Georgia or even potentially like Arizona, but not until after he leaves office in 2029.
So do you think then first of all, I agree 100%. I see those same tweets. Look, I wish it was true. It's just not he's not going to be sentenced to prison time when, in a week or so when the sentencing's supposed to happen. And I think your point is a really important one. And it goes back to what you said earlier when you were introducing yourself, because you have a law degree, you have a political science degree, and you look at these things with a holistic view. And I do think that's an important way to look at it. Because look, a lot of people are very, very unhappy with what is happening. And I, for one, completely understand. But your point cannot be overlooked. It would be so easy to imagine the shoe on the other foot. And these rules that we are crafting have to be generally applicable rules that apply regardless of whether it's your party or your candidate who's on the defense side or the one bringing the charges. And I think that goes to really what you said at the beginning, which is, look, in this situation, while it seems, and we're still going, but it's starting to seem like Donald Trump may be the one individual who is above the law. Your point is a great one, that in that situation, the system that is supposed to apply is the political system. So if the voters decided, like you said, that the crimes he was convicted of in New York or accused of in these 3 other jurisdictions were disqualifying for president, then theoretically, if our system works, he wouldn't have won. The thing about these crimes, they weren't secret. Right? They were brought out in the open. They were, one of them was litigated fully in a court of law. Some of them, the one I was involved in, was on live TV. Anytime there was a hearing, you could obtain all the information you wanted about it on Twitter, on social media, on the internet. And if the voters knew all of that and decided to vote for him anyway, well, then I think a lot of people say, whether I agree with the outcome or not, that is the system we have. So, okay, federal's gone. New York is at least nothing's going to happen to it until he gets out of office in 2029, at which time he'll be, 83, 84 years old. And, I'm not sure that there's going to be anyone who'll be really interested in picking that case back up then, but we'll see. We'll have to do a second interview in 2029, so please clear your calendar. So now, all of democracy, apparently, is in the hands of my good friend, Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, who, by the way, despite the criticism that she's received when it comes not only from the right, when it comes to the Trump prosecution, but also from other folks when it comes to another very large RICO prosecution that I talked about last week, the YSL case, which just ended, at least as to the main defendant, young thug Jeffrey Williams, in a plea. He was sentenced, for those of you who've been living under a rock don't know, 15 years of probation. So same district attorney, Fani Willis, Fulton County DA, that's where I live. By the way, I will disclose something, even though my vote's private. I'm not going to disclose how I voted for anyone else except for Fulton DA. I wrote in, and I swear this is true, Brian Steele. And apparently, that's Young Thug's lawyer, for those of y'all who don't know. And apparently, I was not the only one who wrote it in. Despite my write-in, Fani Willis won overwhelmingly. She's going to be Fulton County District Attorney for the next 4 years. So it's all now on her. So, Professor, what do you say? What happens with the Fulton County case that is pending against Donald Trump and his co-defendants?
Yeah. So I'll pivot on this to this in a second, which is I do think it's important to go back to tap into why people are so frustrated with the fact that Donald Trump, notwithstanding all that he clearly did in the public eye, could be elected to be president. And I think, to me, one of the big issues is that the criminal justice system is just not built to deal with these kind of crimes against democracy. It's just not. And to the extent that it is, it's not built to deal with these things in a quick and efficient way, especially when you have particularly novel issues. And I think so many people have been very quick to call for the short circuiting of due process. It's one of my pet peeves on Twitter is people would yell, "Why isn't this quicker? Why isn't this quicker?" Well, that's just not how due process works. And due process is afforded to everybody, even the people I don't like. I mean, I think nobody would be surprised if they knew who I was, that I detest Donald Trump, but at the same time, he's entitled to due process just like everybody else. Now, the other thing that might be kind of working in the background there is, I would argue that that's the whole point of the 14th Amendment's disqualification clause, right? So for folks who may not be familiar, the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that people who have previously taken an oath to hold office and then committed acts of insurrection or rebellion should be disqualified as a constitutional matter. And to me, that's right. That would be the solution. But we're not living in that world, because the Supreme Court said we're not, and the trials have not been tried, or I should say, have not commenced. There's been no jury impaneled here in Fulton County. So then we have to ask ourselves, well, what's left? And I think the big question here is I guess people would ask, can Donald Trump be tried while president in Fulton County? Of course, the answer is no. You cannot try the sitting president of the United States. It's just not functional in terms of how federalism works or the executive branch works. You cannot have the president trying to run the country and hold the country together while also trying to fend off criminal charges. So I think the answer is just no there. Now, I don't know what happens here, because nobody knows what happens here. There are some options. So first of all, Fani Willis could say, you know what, I'm just not even going to bother anymore, and we're just going to dismiss this entire case against Donald Trump, and we'll move on to all the other co-conspirators who have not pled out, and we're just going to proceed with trial against them. That would be an understandable calculation just in terms of resources, and it might make it might lower the stakes in some senses, in some sense that maybe she thinks she'll get, there's a higher possibility of getting convictions against the others if Donald Trump is just not part of this at all. I'm really not sure. Then there's the other road that she could take, which is potentially say, all right, we'll just pause and hold these proceedings against Trump in abeyance until 2029. Now, I'm really not sure what the formal mechanism is for that. I mean, I don't think anybody really knows, because it's just such a strange posture that we're in, and it's unprecedented. We're just in completely uncharted waters in that sense. But let's assume that there's a way that that can work out, and things are just kind of held back until he leaves office. The big question I would have had to ask is, would there be the political will to do it at that point? Now, maybe not, right? Maybe people would just be like, okay, he's out of office, he's done, who cares? Like, let it go. And then there might be people who say no, that he still needs to be held to account for what people believe he did unlawfully here in Georgia in 2020. And of course, then there's the other big unknown out here, right? Which is, what does Donald Trump do over the next 4 years? Does he do things to aggravate the electorate, to agitate the country, to make people feel that maybe he didn't learn a lesson that he should have learned, in which case there might be some renewed support for prosecuting Trump in a way that maybe we might say is diminished now. So I don't know. I don't really know what to make of all that. I think it's a really complex situation. I think Fani Willis is, she's got different potential solutions. She's got different potential avenues to go down. I don't envy her on that. And of course, on top of this, we have the kind of overhanging proceedings about her disqualification that has been kind of winding its way through the judicial system because of her relationship with Nathan Wade. So, this is really sticky for a lot of different reasons. And then the final point I'll just make is what happens, if the case does proceed. What happens in terms of the kind of trove of evidence that maybe Jack Smith has, that maybe Fani Willis wants to get a hold of, or at least maybe some insights? Are we going to see perhaps some of the individuals who worked on that case in Washington, D.C. find their way down here in Fulton County? I don't know. I mean, who knows? But that's something else I'd be interested to see, is if there's now a kind of a move to say, well, we really need to secure these convictions because ultimately that's a really important endeavor for democracy. And so let's get everybody who would have been working on the parallel case in DC kind of all hands on deck here in Georgia. So that's a really big outstanding question. And of course, the other thing I would note too is that Donald Trump's co-conspirators who have been indicted here in Fulton County have also been in large part indicted in Arizona in a similar case. The statute of limitations in Arizona, might still make those cases in play. If the attorney general there wants to secure an indictment towards the end of Trump's presidency and then attempt to bring him to trial after he leaves office in 2029. Now that's another big open-ended question. A lot of time, will lag between now and then. And of course, all these folks are going to have elections, right? And there's going to be another round of elections. 2028, Fani Willis, is she going to be up for re-election? Does she get primaried? Does she not, does she stumble somehow? Who knows who will be in office in 2029 when this all might come back to a head. So there are a lot of unknowns right now. And there's a lot of uncharted territory that we're about to enter. But I think what we can probably say for certain is, while Donald Trump's future here in Fulton County is unknown, I would be incredibly shocked if the DA's office does not vigorously pursue prosecutions against the remaining co-defendants in the 2020 election case.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think this will just make it even more attractive to do that. And I did want to make this point because I think some people will say, oh, well, the Republicans got away with it. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that statement. However, in fairness, I did want to go back. This idea that a sitting president cannot be charged or sentenced or prosecuted in any way comes, it's never happened before. First of all, everyone should know this. This is the first situation where we're going to have a sitting president who's actually been convicted of crimes and who is facing other charges. But it's not the first time where that was a possibility. And I'm sure the first time that was a possibility was sometime, in the 19th century. But in the modern era, the first time we think about is Richard Nixon. And during the Nixon administration, when that was brought up as a possibility, the Nixon Department of Justice wrote a memo in which it concluded, based on principles of federalism and various provisions of the Constitution, that a sitting president indeed cannot be prosecuted. Then, next time that issue really came up to a point where people thought it might happen was in 2000. And that was when Bill Clinton was president. And Bill Clinton was tied up in various different allegations of criminal activity, even though he was never charged. And his DOJ issued another memo that reaffirmed the principle in the 1973 Nixon memo and said, we agree. Sitting presidents are just absolutely immune from prosecution. They cannot be prosecuted for federal or state crimes. So even though the first time it has happened is now with Donald Trump and we're having to deal with it, it's not the first time it's been contemplated. And we do have kind of what I'll say is bipartisan support for the idea that there are good reasons why a president shouldn't be able to be prosecuted. You spoke about them, Professor. The memos that the DOJ released in 1973 and 2000 spoke about them. And basically the bottom line is a president could not do their job if there was a threat of these types of prosecutions. And so that's the rule we have. Right now, it's benefiting Donald Trump, clearly. All right, so it sounds like then, kind of going back to the beginning, that the statement, no one is above the law, at least for now, until January 21st, 2029, when somebody else takes office, and we'll see what happens then. At least for now, Donald Trump is above criminal law. He cannot be prosecuted. He cannot be sentenced for the charges that he was already prosecuted for. He could have faced political consequences for his conduct. The voters decided, and it appears the majority of the voters decided he will not face those consequences. And so is it correct to say now that there is at least one person in the United States that is above the law for now?
I think so. It's, I really try to push back against kind of the hyperinflated rhetoric and some of the, folks who seem to have their hair on fire, at every turn. And so to me, it's really hard to say, somebody does seem to be above the law, but I think that's an inescapable conclusion at this point, that when you have somebody who can commit potential, or allegedly massive acts of crime, massive crimes against democracy, and just walk away, that does seem to smack, of something less than, or something that's not quite up to par with what we would call the rule of law. And so there is some real issues there. And I think one final note I might even make is that there is a real dilemma that we face in terms of how to proceed here. And it's a real important one, which is, in various different, moments in America, outside of America, international, if you look at a variety of fledgling democracies, when people who tend to be strongmen are faced with the prospect of either giving up power or going to prison, that creates a dictator's dilemma, right? And so for somebody who many Americans believe has a kind of an authoritarian impulse, I think it requires some consideration, whether or not, sentencing Donald Trump to jail in New York, but then suspending the sentence pending his, the end of his presidency, or even holding the prospect of a prosecution in Fulton County over his head. There's some real risks there in that sense. On the other hand, particularly with the Fulton County case, with somebody who does not have any real political constraints, in the sense that he can't run for re-election again, maybe being on his best behavior is the best way for him to get rid of the Fulton County case, or to make sure the Fulton County case doesn't ever come to trial. And so perhaps holding the trial out there as still a possibility might be a real constraint on him to some extent. But, of course, Donald Trump doesn't seem to be constrained by much. So, I just put that out there to suggest that the choices that are out there have real consequences and could have real, kind of real impacts on our future. And they may seem inconsequential now, or they may be things that people aren't thinking about now. But if people truly believe that Donald Trump is, the kind of authoritarian-minded individual that, they've said for the last 4 years that he is, then throwing the book at him may not necessarily be in the country's best interest. On the other hand, maybe keeping a case open and waiting and seeing may have, may yield some benefits too. So I don't know what the answer is. I'm just here to observe, watch, and write about this stuff. But I do think that these are really important, crucial issues that warrant kind of a deeper reflection than some of the knee-jerk reactions we've seen by some folks over the past couple of days and weeks and months.
Amen. I agree with that 100%. And that is a very interesting way to put it. And I think a good way to leave it, not exactly, I'm not going to say it's a happy way or positive or peachy way to leave it, but it is a realistic way to leave it. And I appreciate that. I doubt when you decided you wanted to go through political science, get your PhD, get your law degree, become a constitutional law professor, instead of studying the past and all the things that have happened with constitutional law in the past, I doubt you assumed that you would be talking about the most significant constitutional crises we've maybe ever had happening right now in real time. So I know it's probably an exciting time for you. I'm sure you wish it wasn't. I wish it wasn't either. But I really do appreciate you being out there and being a leading voice in this and trying to be a voice of reason. So thank you. We appreciate it. We hope to have you on again sometime soon, hopefully to talk about something a little more positive. But thanks for joining, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks for having me.